just this week, the European Union did something genuinely decisive. They moved faster than anyone expected, formally adopting a ban on Russian LNG that will fully take effect by the start of 2027, a full year ahead of schedule. This is a powerful, concrete step to finally sever a major energy tie with Russia. But in today's broken geopolitical landscape, no decisive action comes without a hidden cost, because this bold move immediately plunges Europe into its next great paradox, winning independence from one supplier, only to find itself held hostage by the very allies it now depends upon. Welcome back to the Energy Flux podcast. I'm your host, Seb Kennedy, founding editor of Energy Flux, the independent newsletter analysing gas and LNG markets and global geopolitics. I'm going to talk through three major and interconnected news stories that hit the news wires this week. One is the EU's decision to finalise its Russian LNG ban by the 1st of January 2027. The second is the question of the EU's own sustainability regulations. And the third is the US issuance of new sanctions against Russia's biggest oil companies. Let's talk through each of these in turn. So the EU countries on Thursday formally adopted the 19th package of sanctions against Russia. There are lots of elements to it. I'm going to focus on the LNG ban, which seems to be the most material and most relevant to energy. The ban will take effect in two stages, with short-term contracts ending after 6 months and long-term contracts from the 1st of January 2027, which is 1 year earlier than the Commission's roadmap for its overall ban on Russian gas from all sources. So let's put this into context, shall we? EU imports of Russian gas have obviously come down a huge amount, but LNG is perhaps the kind of the last great frontier of European dependence on Russian energy. The EU 27 imported around about 14 million tons of LNG from Russia this year, which accounts for about 15% of the bloc's total LNG imports, or about 18 billion cubic meters of regasified LNG. Most likely, this loss will be almost entirely replaced by increases in imports of LNG from global markets, thanks to a growing wave of new supply, which I've talked about at length in Energy Flux. Global LNG market is, of course, steadily pivoting into a situation of oversupply, which is why news of the accelerated ban caused only a minor hiccup in the traded price of gas on the TTF, which is the European benchmark for gas trading. So the futures prices on TTF for month ahead contracts are only just above 32 euros per megawatt hour, which is kind of towards the upper band of the channel of prices that we've been witnessing over the summer. So no huge great price increase from this ban, but that doesn't mean it's irrelevant. On the contrary, the ban is a big deal. It's not a half measure. It's an accelerated, politically difficult decision for the EU. The EU is cutting off 15% of their LNG imports, knowing it will cause market tightness, if not outright price spikes. And combined with the subsequent ban on all Russian pipeline gas, which is due to come into effect a year later on the 1st of January 2028, this measure will force a painful rewiring of the EU energy grid, especially for landlocked nations like Hungary and Slovakia, which had been threatening to halt these measures from being implemented. But this decisive act to accelerate the LNG ban has an inescapable logic. To replace Russian gas and LNG, Europe must turn to other major suppliers, and the world's LNG kingpin is now the United States, closely followed by Qatar. So in one bold stroke, you could say, Europe swaps a dependency on a geopolitical adversary for a deep structural dependency on an increasingly capricious ally. And this is where the paradox kicks in, because almost immediately after making this tough decision to assert its sovereignty, Europe is being reminded of the strings attached to its new energy relationship, because now Europe finds itself in a position where its new suppliers feel empowered to dictate terms. What does that mean? Well, enter the next story of our three-story discussion today, the EU's own proposed sustainability regulations. I'm talking about the Corporate Sustainability and Due Diligence Directive, or the CSDDD for short. This measure, which is being debated, would require firms operating in the EU to fix any human rights and environmental issues present in their supply chains or face fines of 5% of global turnover. The CSDDD is coming under sustained lobbying pressure, and it has been this way for months now. The US and Qatar this week reiterated warnings that they could disrupt supply if the regulations are not watered down. And EU lawmakers are debating whether to do so. The European Parliament is split along ideological lines over this issue. But let's deconstruct this threat, because that dependency cuts both ways. About 70% of American LNG goes to Europe, 67 million tons so far in 2025. None is going to China due to tariffs introduced in response to American President Donald Trump's trade war. There is literally nowhere else on Earth willing and able to import an additional 67 million tons of LNG overnight. And that's only accounting for the American portion. Qatar also exports LNG, not so much to Europe, but there is a not immaterial amount going from Qatar to Europe. And if this threat was to be followed through upon, then Qatar would also have to find alternative places for those cargoes. And just going back to the American LNG question, I mean, who is to tell US LNG off-takers, i.e. European utilities and international oil companies, where they can or cannot send their US LNG cargoes? Because that defeats the whole point of US LNG. The USP, the unique selling point of American LNG, is destination flexibility. You can send your cargoes anywhere. So these seem like empty threats or half measures. And let's not forget a further paradox at the heart of this power play. The US and Qatar sell LNG to their allies as a means of enhancing their energy security, only for them to turn around and then attempt to blackmail the EU into weakening their regulations under the threat of withholding supply if they don't. You simply can't have it both ways. And that brings us on to our third topic. This week, the US placed full sanctions on Russia's two largest oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft, which together account for about half of Russian oil output. Brent crude prices rose by about 5% on Thursday to about $65 per barrel in response to these measures. And Indian and Chinese state importers are reportedly halting purchases to avoid falling foul of sanctions and being slapped with secondary sanctions. These measures are a big deal, even bigger deal than the EU's Russian LNG ban. They would have huge repercussions for, in particular, Lukoil, which has various economic activities in Europe. There's a refinery in Bulgaria that would have to cease operations or face secondary sanctions. Hungary and Slovakia would have to stop importing Russian oil from Lukoil via the Druzhba pipeline from Russia. And in Turkey, then one of the largest refineries in Turkey, it refines Russian crude oil supplied by Lukoil into petroleum products, which are then sold into the EU. All of this will have to stop. And Lukoil has other assets, including refinery stakes in the Netherlands and Romania, oil terminals, it has wholesale and retail fuel chains. All of this is under threat from this sanctions package from the US. But here's the dysfunctional element of this third part of the story. It all depends on enforcement. Sanctions mean nothing if they are not enforced. And we've seen a lack of enforcement already, because Novatek, Russia's biggest LNG exporter, is still exporting sanctioned LNG to China with impunity. 10 cargoes so far have docked at an LNG terminal in southern China, which has been dedicated to receiving sanctioned shipments of the Russian fuel. So, what's to stop these new Russian oil sanctions from suffering the same fate? We have a Lukoil refinery in Bulgaria, oil flows into Hungary and Slovakia, and a massive refinery in Turkey processing Lukoil crude for the EU. Will all of this actually stop? If not, then you have to ask, is this all just a big tactic to get Putin, Russia's President Vladimir Putin, back to the negotiating table and strong-arm him into a ceasefire? Or is the goal really to cripple Russia's war machine and deliver a decisive end to the conflict, regardless of the economic consequences for the Western powers enforcing these sanctions? Because I think what we're really watching here is an exercise in managed coercion. Western powers trying to strike a delicate balance between increasing pressure on the one hand and maintaining credibility, while on the other avoiding destabilizing effects that undermine their own economies and generate political blowback at home. The problem is Western powers have been going through these same motions since invasion began, the full invasion began in February 2022, and we're nowhere closer to a definitive solution to the Ukraine conflict. The unavoidable reality which Russia continues to demonstrate with every fresh drone attack wave on Ukrainian civilian targets is that without consistent enforcement and without a clear end game that involves allowing Ukraine to fight Russia without one arm tied behind its back, and I'm talking here about military aid to Ukraine and restrictions on Ukraine's ability to use Western missiles and munitions to strike military targets deep inside Russia, then these powerful-looking sanctions become just another volatile half measure in a world full of them. So let's tie it all together. We see a Europe that is, in fact, capable of decisive action, despite internal division. The accelerated LNG ban proves this. But in our current geopolitical reality, that decisiveness doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to a new, more complex form of dependency. The ban forces Europe to rely on the US and Qatar, who immediately test Europe's sovereignty with empty threats, hilariously, perhaps, undermining one of the main selling points of their own primary product, namely the energy security of LNG. And at the same time, Europe's primary security partner, or ostensibly so, the US, demonstrates a strategy of imposing sanctions that are powerful on paper, but undermined by a track record of spotty enforcement. Geopolitics in the Ukraine era is often framed as a story of weakness versus strength, but in reality, it's a story of a world where every assertive action creates a new vulnerability, and every display of power is undercut by a lack of convincing follow-through. Europe gets tough on Russia, only to face pressure from America. America gets tough on Russian oil, but lacks the will to fully enforce existing sanctions on Russian LNG. And Qatar and America get tough on EU regulations, but are powerless to follow through on their empty threats to halt supplies. And then there's another huge curveball to throw into the mix. What happens if the US slaps 100% additional tariffs on China on the 1st of November, as Donald Trump has threatened to do? That would blow up the very global economic system that this entire fragile energy dance is designed to protect. We're not navigating a new world order here. We're sort of stumbling through a profound and dangerous disorder, and the tail risk of unintended consequences is just piling up with every incremental measure towards a kind of poorly defined end goal or end state. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks for listening to the end. If you enjoyed this commentary, then you'll find plenty more of it on the Energy Flux website. Head on over to www.energyflux.news, where you can sign up for free to receive updates whenever I publish new geopolitical essays, analytical chart decks, and long-form features that take a deep dive into underreported segments of the energy complex. Sadly, I have to paywall most of my content because Energy Flux is my main income stream. So if you want to get full access to all of it, then you'll need to take up a paid subscription, but you will get plenty in return for that. There are various subscription tiers available. Head on over to energyflux.news/subscribe for all the information. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.